In the first 20 years of the Rebbe's Nesius, there was a pre-Farbrengen before the big Farbrengen. The Rebbe used to come downstairs and Farbrengen you Beis Tamuz. In the early years, the Rebbe used to go to the halls. There used to be Farbrengens outside of 770. Were different halls around Crown Heights where the Rebbe would go for Farbrengen before they expanded the shul. But before the Farbrengen, there was a small Farbrengen upstairs on the second floor of 770 in the Friedrich Rebbe's apartment. The Friedrich Rebbe's Mohammedina was still alive, and there used to be a little Farbrengen, some Elter Chassidim, and the Rebbe would also participate in this short L'chaim and smallish Farbrengen. In Tovshin Tez Zayin, in 1956, there was a Chasid, Reb Zalman Duchman. At that Farbrengen, he was also upstairs there, and he tells the crowd and the Rebbe was present. He tells the Rebbe that if not for the Rebbe, we wouldn't have this Farbrengen. We wouldn't have this Yom Tov of Beis Tamuz at all. And he wanted to share some stories that he remembers from Tafresh Peizayin, 1927, the story of Beis Tamuz. But the Rebbe smiled and the Rebbe motioned to him, there's no need and he should stop. So he stopped. But afterwards, Chassidim approached him and said, and now tell us, we want to hear. But Reb Zalman said, the Rebbe didn't want, so he's not sharing. He didn't share. But we do know, first of all, he himself, in his Zichronos that he wrote some anecdotes that involved the Rebbe in the Parsha of the imprisonment and the Geul of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And over the years, many other documents, letters from the Rebbe himself, letters from the Frierdiker Rebbe, many other inyanim came to light that give us a slight inkling of the Rebbe's involvement in the Parsha of Beis Tamuz. And the Rebbe once by Farbrengen, years later, said that the events surrounding Beis Tamuz are in front of him, they're alive, there's chakukim bezichroini kemoi chai, they're engraved in my zikaron as if it happened now. And the Rebbe was involved in the Parsha. I'm going to share some of these inyanim, when you read the Haggadah Shel Pesach. So we have to start with the Golus Mitzrayim in order to appreciate the Geula of Mitzrayim, from Mitzrayim. So likewise, to understand the Geula of Beis Tamuz, so we have to talk a little bit about the lead up to the imprisonment of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and then the Geula of Beis Tamuz. The Frierdiker Rebbe moved from Rostov to Leningrad, Peterburg as it was called then, later was changed to Leningrad, in the year 1924, Tafresh Pei Dalet, after Pesach, Chasidishe. And from then on, the Rebbe started to visit his future father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, very frequently in Leningrad. The Rebbe lived in Yekaterinoslav, and he came and went back and came again, kept on visiting. The Rebbe already was in Rostov by the Frierdiker Rebbe in 1923. The first time, that's also something that we didn't know exactly. For many years, people had an assumption or a wish, I don't know what it was, but people said they think that the first time the Rebbe came to the Frierdiker Rebbe was Parshas Boy of the year Tafresh Pei Gimel. Parshas Boy 1923. Why did they think so? Because that Shabbos, the Frierdiker Rebbe said the Maimer Bossi Legani, which many years later, the Frierdiker Rebbe published for Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud, which is a famous Bossi Legani Maimer. So people thought, we knew that the Rebbe came to the Frierdiker Rebbe in 1923, so Tafresh Pei Gimel, that was a year. But only many years after Gimel Tamuz, a note that Rav Chadakov had written, one day he was working and he wrote down, today when I was by the Rebbe Shlita in the office, the Rebbe shared with me that the first time he was by the Frierdiker Rebbe was on Sukkot of the year Tafresh Pei Gimel. So that's Sukkot 1922. Already in Rostov, the Rebbe visited the Frierdiker Rebbe. That was the first time. And of course, the shidduch between the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin had come up. the Frierdiker Rebbe checked out the Rebbe, so to speak. I mean, that's not what I decided. The Frierdiker Rebbe actually wrote to the Rebbetzin that he spent many hours studying the Sugya, Hilchas Menachem, and the Frierdiker Rebbe checked him out. Yeah, Teiras Mendel, yeah. But he liked what he saw apparently. Yeah, Baruch Hashem. But these are things that we don't understand too much about those things. But then the Rebbe didn't travel to Rostov frequently. But once the Frierdiker Rebbe moved to Leningrad, he started going very often. And Rabbi Tzimchane shared years later that the Frierdiker Rebbe wouldn't let him leave, wouldn't let him go. He wanted the Rebbe near him all the time. And it wasn't just in because his future son-in-law. It was also Pashat, the Rebbe's work for the Frierdiker Rebbe was very, very important. The Rebbe's involvement in everything that was going on was a constant need. So the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted the Rebbe nearby. Yeah, but the Rebbe went home every so often and came back. But we see that in the lead up of before we start with the Hafatzas Hayadus, the underground network of yeshivas and rabbanim and chadorim and all that, which the Rebbe was involved with as well. First thing, the Frierdiker Rebbe opened up for the Rebbe all his eitzres. In those years in Leningrad, the Rebbe had full access to all the Maimorim, all the Ksavim, all the letters. Whenever the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote a letter, the Frierdiker Rebbe was extremely organized. The Rebbe didn't have so much time for that. The Rebbe was also extremely organized, but he relied too much on others, and they let him down. But the Rebbe didn't have time for it. The Frierdiker Rebbe was extremely meticulous. Every piece of paper he kept. If the Frierdiker Rebbe went to a hotel, he took a piece of the stationery from the hotel, and on the back he wrote, "This is the hotel. I stayed here from here today," in his archives. All these kind of papers we have from the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe also was like that. People sent to the Rebbe, Rebbe Wolf from Eretz Yisrael used to send regularly clippings from newspapers in Eretz Yisrael about Lubavitch, anything that involved Chabad. The Rebbe would write on the envelope. He would send a week or 2 weeks worth of clippings. On the envelope in which all of them came, the Rebbe wrote down the dates of all the newspapers that are in that envelope. The Rebbe went through that. It's the Rebbe's holy time. We can't even imagine. Even in the Rebbe's room, where the Rebbe's room was, anyone who had seen it live, or those who saw it on pictures, you see piles and piles of sfarim and papers, and it seemed like this is a big balagan. I heard from my shver, my father-in-law, which I share with Rav Meir Shimon. My shver was Rabbi Yamin Klein, one of the Rebbe's secretaries. Whenever there was a Yechidus night, when people went into Yechidus, the room didn't look like that. Everything was gone. The table was empty. It was clean. Where did everything go? That's a little secret. If you're ever in the Rebbe's room, in the back of the room, there's a door between the Sfarim. There's like a Sfarim shop on the right, a Sfarim shop on the left, and there's a little door in the middle. Now that little door goes into a little hallway behind the Rebbe's room, and there's a bathroom there, a toilet. Right? But Yechidus night, they would put out on the floor in that little hallway in front of the bathroom newspapers, and all the Sfarim and all the piles had to be put away for the Yechidus, and then the next morning it all went back on the Rebbe's desk. But the Maskirim had to remember the exact order of each pile. The Rebbe knew, although it looked like hundreds of Sfarim, like piled, some of them open, some of them closed, and the Rebbe knew each sefer where it was. I heard from my Shver that one time the Rebbe was looking for a certain sefer, and the Rebbe told him it should be in that pile over there, somewhere in the middle. The Rebbe knew where each sefer belonged and where it is, although it seemed mamish like a big balagan, but it wasn't. The Rebbe was very, very organized. When the Frierdiker Rebbe allowed the Rebbe access of all the Ksovim, it included also the Frierdiker Rebbe's own archive of all the letters. Whenever the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote a letter, there was a copy that was kept in the archive. The Rebbe trusted that the secretaries will take care of that copying and keeping copies. It worked. I don't know. I don't want to make guesses. Maybe 70% of the time, and we keep on finding now letters from the Rebbe that nobody ever knew of. And actually now there's a new volume of Igros Kodesh of the year Tafshin Lamed Ches coming out. But the Frierdiker Rebbe made sure, I don't know exactly how it was, could be also the Frierdiker Rebbe secretaries took care of some of it, but the Frierdiker Rebbe numbered it, and then the Frierdiker Rebbe gave it all to the Rebbe. The Rebbe Pashat went through everything. The Rebbe had to know everything, the whole history of Lubavitch, every Maimer Chasidis, every last Ksaviat Kodesh of any of the Rebbeim, the Rebbe went through everything. About 20 years ago, they found in Russia a few cases of the Frierdiker Rebbe's archive that somehow it actually went out of Russia. It went to Poland because it was from the years in Poland, but somehow it ended up in Russia. The Nazis confiscated it or something. We don't know exactly.
To the whole library.
Huh?
That's what happened to the whole library.
Yeah, but that's Sfarim. Here we're talking more about the Frierdiker Rebbe's own writings and things like that. So a few cases of all kinds of letters ended up in Russia, and then it came to the Rebbe's library. So I had the schus to go through it and just make a catalog before they were filing it away to know what is in there. You know, there's all kinds of letters from the Frierdiker Rebbe, some papers that I mentioned before that the Frierdiker Rebbe writes different things. But the Rebbe's, our Rebbe's handwriting is also all over the place. So, for example, there's like a pile of letters that the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote in the early 20s about Agudas Yisrael. So the Rebbe put them all together and put a file, like a folder around it, and wrote on it Agudas Yisrael, Tafresh Pei Beis, or whatever, and that's in the Rebbe's handwriting. And the whole archive is like that, where the Frierdiker Rebbe kept it all, but the Rebbe apparently organized it further and made different piles that we can see how that happened in those years when the Rebbe was not yet married, but the Frierdiker Rebbe opened up all the oitzres for the Rebbe to see. During those years, when the Rebbe was in Leningrad, the Rebbe also started, besides for going through the Frierdiker Rebbe's oitzres, the Rebbe also started to work on behalf of Klal Yisrael in Russia, the Frierdiker Rebbe's network of Chadorim and Yeshivas. So there were different people who were very involved. There was Rav Zevin, who lived then in Leningrad for a few years as well, and actually became very close. The Frierdiker Rebbe asked Rav Zevin to check out the Rebbe too. This was still in the beginning, so it was like Motzei Tisha B'Av. Rav Zevin and the Rebbe ate by the Frierdiker Rebbe, and then the next day, the Rebbe left Leningrad, and Rav Zevin also, and they traveled on the same train. So the Frierdiker Rebbe told Rav Zevin, we know this from Rav Zevin's grandson, who shared this later, he heard this from his grandfather, that for many hours they spent together on the train. Rav Zevin later reported back to the Frierdiker Rebbe and said like this: what I was more nispol from, besides for the Rebbe's brilliance and genius in every place in Torah, but his Yiras Shamayim, his deep Yiras Shamayim, totally amazed me. But Rav Zevin, the Rebbe testified about Rav Zevin. It's in a letter, then also in the Sichot, the Rebbe spoke about this. The Rebbe said about Rav Zevin that he was from the Frierdiker Rebbe's close confidants, and who helped the Frierdiker Rebbe, was his, Rebbe said, his maskil, and worked without regard for himself, with Mesirus Nefesh, for Yiddishkeit in Russia. Rav Zevin later left Russia and he came to Eretz Yisrael and was a big Rav. And he was a big Rav already then. Beforehand, he was a Rav. Before he came to Leningrad. But Rav Zevin himself was a famous Gaon. He authored the Encyclopedia Talmudis. He was like on top of the whole project of Encyclopedia Talmudis, etc. But he was Pashut. The emphasis, he wasn't from a Lubavitch family. He was from a Chabad family. He came really from the Kapuster stock. But by the Frierdiker Rebbe, like the Rebbe said many times, that all the Necholim, all the rivers come back to Lubavitch. And Rav Zevin Pashut became the Frierdiker Rebbe's Amensh. And the Rebbe worked together with Rav Zevin in those years on organizing Yiddishkeit all over Russia under the leadership of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Sing noch an Egen. I'm talking too much. Chaim, Chaim. Ay, 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 Leading up to the imprisonment of the Frierdiker Rebbe, there were a few inyanim. Now, obviously, everybody knows that the Frierdiker Rebbe was imprisoned because he led this entire network of underground chadorim and yeshivas and mikvahs and rabbonim and shoftim, the whole Yiddishkeit. So obviously, they didn't like that, and that's why they imprisoned the Frierdiker Rebbe. But when we look in what was found in the archives, they actually have the files of the interrogation that they interrogated the Frierdiker Rebbe. We see that there are two themes that are brought up by the interrogators over there, and not only in the interrogation of the Frierdiker Rebbe, actually they also interrogated others, Chassidim, and they asked them also questions relating to these two things, which we see from that these two in Yonim somehow really ruffle their feathers or something. They and it's hard for us to understand why that, but these are two inyanim that the Rebbe was involved with. On the night of Shmini Atzeres, Tov Reish Pei Vav, this is it's like a year and a half plus before the Frierdiker Rebbe was imprisoned. A guy showed up in Leningrad by the Frierdiker Rebbe's Hakofis, before Hakofis. And he was a professor from Moscow. He wants to speak to the Frierdiker Rebbe. A goyish professor. So the Chassidim told him, it's Yom Tov, you can't meet. And this. But the guy seemed very important looking, and he insisted that he traveled especially to meet the Frierdiker Rebbe. He must see him. So someone went in and approached the Frierdiker Rebbe and told the Frierdiker Rebbe, we don't know exactly what this guy wants and who he is and what this is about, but is this professor from Moscow? He insists he must see the Rebbe. The Rebbe said, tell him it's Yom Tov, he should come back after Yom Tov. So Chaim Lieberman went outside and told the guy, you have to come back in 2 days. He was very upset that he has to waste time now, but he had no choice, so he said, okay, fine, I'll wait and I'll come back in a few days.
He was a Yid?
He was a goy, a professor. He came back, Chavav or Chav Zayin Tishrei. How do I know Chavav or Chav Zayin? Because the Frierdiker Rebbe writes that, Chavav or Chav Zayin. So I guess it's either Chavav or Chav Zayin. The Frierdiker Rebbe wrote that later on. And this professor came into the Frierdiker Rebbe and said like this, he's running some type of intellectual group, and they're dealing with all kinds of hidden sciences, spiritual stuff. He wants to know what does Chasidishe have to say about the Magen David and about knowledge of the future, Kabbalah, and things like that. The Frierdiker Rebbe told him that Chasidishe doesn't deal with this kind of stuff. Chasidishe is a different type of school of thought, but the guy wanted very much, if there's anything in Kabbalah, the Frierdiker Rebbe told him that soon my there wasn't yet a son-in-law, but the future son-in-law, Rabbi Simchana said the story, said the Frierdiker Rebbe referred to him as my minister of education will come and you'll meet with him, you'll talk to him. Rabbi Simchana says that the Rebbe sat for 3 months writing an entire book for this professor. Anything in Torah, Yiddishkeit related to the Magen David, what this guy needed it for, nobody knows. The Rebbe even traveled to Moscow to meet with this professor Brechenko in his house. And with that, the Frierdiker Rebbe sort of helped this guy because he knew that the Frierdiker Rebbe that's what he said, that the reason he turned to the Rebbe, to the Frierdiker Rebbe, was because the Frierdiker Rebbe is the leader of Klal Yisrael, and he is the biggest scholar in Inyanim of Kabbalah, and that's why he turned to Lubavitch, because they're the only one who can help him in his research. He then sent money to the Frierdiker Rebbe, a lot of money. He sent, we don't know exactly how much he sent. Later on in the interrogation, the Frierdiker Rebbe was asked about this. The Frierdiker Rebbe said that he doesn't remember if it was 150, 200 or 250 ruble, which was a huge amount of money. And the Frierdiker Rebbe immediately returned the money right back to him. The guy got very offended, the professor, and he wrote back to the Frierdiker Rebbe that he understands from the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe sent back the money, that the Frierdiker Rebbe is still suspicious of his motives and he doesn't trust him, which was actually true. Rabbi Lechaim Altois writes in his diary about this whole parsha. Rabbi Lechaim writes, the Frierdiker Rebbe was mekayim about this person, kabdeyu v'chashdeyu. Respect him, but be suspicious of him. Don't trust him fully. So the guy wrote to Frierdiker Rebbe that his research was done, work was put in. The Rebbe put in all that work. The Frierdiker Rebbe gave this all over to the Rebbe, delegated it to the Rebbe. The Rebbe did all this work. But the guy wrote, I'm paying, it takes time and effort, and so I'm paying for the services. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't want it. The guy came back to Leningrad to meet with the Frierdiker Rebbe again. The Frierdiker Rebbe wrote a letter to this professor, although he spoke to him face to face. Apparently, the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted it documented. The Frierdiker Rebbe knew that his mail is being read by numerous people, not just by the recipient. So the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted it documented. He sent a letter to this professor that stating again, you have turned to us about your research, but this is really not. I was trying to see if our sciences have any common ground, but it became obvious that it barely touches, but you really are into a totally different field, so therefore there's nothing really that we have in common, and there's nothing to continue this relationship. Apparently the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted that documented as proof that they have had nothing to do with this guy. So we see that the Rebbe was very much involved in this parsha. When the Frierdiker Rebbe was imprisoned, one of the things that they interrogated him, and the interrogations were written down. There was nobody standing there and writing down word for word. They just wrote the main points. But we know also from the Frierdiker Rebbe and also from Rabbi Leivik, the Rebbe's father's interrogation, and also from other Chassidim, they were interrogated for hours. And then in the file, it's like a page, 2 pages, 3 pages. It's very brief. They just wrote down a few pages, but they write down, they ask him, what do you have to do with Professor Brachenko? Why did he come to you? Did he send you money? How much money? What did you do with the money? So apparently the Frierdiker Rebbe, this Kabdei v'chashdeyu, the Frierdiker Rebbe told them the same thing that he already said in that letter and that he told the guy. But this was one area where we see that the Rebbe's involvement with the imprisonment wasn't just stam. There was a very direct connection to the whole story of Yubis Tamuz. Then there was another thing. Yes, Brachenko was killed. A few years later, they imprisoned him and they shot him to death. Yeah. Apparently, he was against the Russian government. Something we don't know. We have no idea. We don't know exactly the plotim, but that's.
Was this under Stalin?
This was before Stalin.
Before Stalin?
Was already Stalin.
What year?
1926, 27.
Stalin.
Was Stalin. Yeah.
There was Stalin's method.
Yeah. Good. Anyways.
It's not part of the history.
Hey, it is.
Everything.
Tafshin Yud Gimel. Put him Tafshin Yud Gimel. So that part is his end, not his beginning. Okay, I hear. Then there was something else. There was a conference of Jewish leaders that was organized behind the scenes by the communists, but it was like different rabbis worked to arrange this conference. The Frierdiker Rebbe was strongly opposed to this conference, and the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote some letters against the conference and didn't want anyone to participate in the conference because that conference was all staged, that the Rabbanim will be compelled to say what they want them to say. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was against the conference. One of the people who was involved in the conference was like actually the Rav, Rabbi Tevel Katzenellenberg, he was the Rav of Leningrad, and he was involved in that conference. We ever went out against that conference. But the Rebbe, we don't know exactly how it came about. There was a Rav who came into Yechidus to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he suggested to the Frierdiker Rebbe to let's make our own conference. Instead of having this argument against that, we'll make our own conference with Rabbanim, and the Frierdiker Rebbe liked that idea. So who did the Frierdiker Rebbe appoint? His son-in-law, the Rebbe, his future son-in-law, the Rebbe. So the next day, there was a 3.5-hour meeting between the Rebbe and this other Rav, Litkin or something like that was his name. Liskin, I don't remember. And some others. And they arranged this counter conference, which actually happened a few months later. And this is the other topic that the Frierdiker Rebbe was interrogated about. They asked him, why are you against the conference of rabbis and leaders that we wanted to do? The Frierdiker Rebbe told them in the face, because this wasn't a conference where the Rabbanim are going to tell the leaders what needs to be done. They were going to tell the Rabbanim what needs to be done. That's why I was opposed. And so again, we see how the Rebbe's activities during that 2-3 years leading up to the Frierdiker Rebbe's imprisonment were not just also things that were, these were the major things that actually led to the Frierdiker Rebbe's imprisonment. On Purim Cotton, Tafresh Pezayin, the Frierdiker Rebbe said the famous Maimer, V'kibla Yehudim. That was in Moscow. The Frierdiker Rebbe traveled to Moscow. He said the Maimer, the whole shul was packed. People were standing outside the shul and listening in through the open windows. And there were spies from the KGB. And the Frierdiker Rebbe openly defied the government. In that Maimer, he spoke very strongly about chinuch, that you have to give the children a chinuch of Torah and not to be nispal. And that was another thing that was, the Frierdiker Rebbe himself said that it led up to the imprisonment. Purim Cotton Pezayin, the Rebbe wasn't in Moscow, but Purim, a month later, the Frierdiker Rebbe was back in Leningrad. Purim Pezayin was a Farbrengen. The Rebbe was there. Many years later, by Farbrengen, the Rebbe once shared an anecdote of that Farbrengen. And the Frierdiker Rebbe finished the Farbrengen, Purim Pezayin. The Frierdiker Rebbe went back to his room, but the Chassidim stayed and continued to Farbrengen. The Rebbe said that Rabbi Yaakov Zaravitcher, Rabbi Yankel Zaravitcher, sat down on the floor and he sang Koil Bayar. That was like late in the night of Purim Pezayin. But the Farbrengen, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was still there, was a fiery Farbrengen. Just to read about it gives us the chills. It's hard to imagine. The Frierdiker Rebbe stood up at the Farbrengen and he opened up his shirt and was banging his chest, and he told Rabbi Elochaim Altois that, are you going to write to all the cities, to everyone, that we had a big Rebbe, my father, the Rebbe Rashab, and he left over a son, himself. and he said that everyone has to give his children a Torah chinuch. Don't be afraid of anyone. Those that are going to put their children into the shkola, into the public school system, they won't be moitzi shnosam. They won't live out the year. And the Fig Rebbe screamed at El-Chaim, you hear what I'm saying? Are you going to write that? Are you going to write this to all the cities? Fig Rebbe was very serious. At the Farbrengen, there were agents of the KGB standing in the crowd. The Chassidim knew who they were. And throughout the Farbrengen, they kept on looking and glancing at them, very nervous. Fig Rebbe is standing and talking like that while they're standing right there. And the Fig Rebbe went on like that. He kept on going like that. Rabbi Chaim Altes writes in his diary of that, after that Farbrengen, the Chassidim all became very, very anxious. They felt that it's only a question of time now. Something bad is going to happen. That's what he writes. That was the mood by Chassidim. Already before Purim, there was already a build-up. They knew that they're out to get the Frierdiker Rebbe. But that Farbrengen, he describes how these agents were standing there and they were obviously plotting, hearing the Frierdiker Rebbe talk like that. But they couldn't show openly that they're agents, but everybody was able to see on their faces. So they knew that disaster is looming. As I said, the Rebbe was present at that Farbrengen. Another interesting thing that by that Farbrengen, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, referred to a word like Favel and Nikolai, and the Chassidim didn't know what the Frierdiker Rebbe is referring to. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, the story is a known story, you know. So the Chassidim said, no, we don't know. Can the Rebbe please share with us the story? The Frierdiker Rebbe told them that the Tsar, Favel, he wanted to have his son, Nikolai I, trained in army maneuvers and different things. So he sent him to a different city, and over there he went through all the training and the maneuvers, and he did very well. He excelled.
Who is this? Who are you talking about?
The Tsar sent his son, his future Tsar. And he excelled and did very well. And then he was very happy that he got all the medals and he excelled in everything. But he is the son of the Tsar. So at the end of the training, so as the son of the Tsar, he gave out gifts to everyone over there, all the generals and everyone. When he came back to his father told him like this: I'm very, very pleased with how well you did in the training, in the maneuvers, everything. I'm really impressed. However, what you did afterwards, I'm not so impressed with. Actually, there isn't extra money flying around here, and the gifts that you allowed yourself to share with the different generals are way over the top. So because you did that, you're exiled for the next 2 years. So the Frierdiker Rebbe referred to that story, that he had asked his father, the Rebbe Rashab, Azevi Nikolai, Azevi Favel Nikolai, and the Rashab had responded to Frierdiker Rebbe, yeah, there's going to be something negative. the Rebbe many years later said, but today, then, that one time there was a situation where it was, yeah, like Nikolai, but now we can say not like Nikolai. Even if sometimes we mess up a bit, we shouldn't be punished for it. So that was Purim Pei Zayin. And then came the night of the imprisonment. Yeah, Tezvav Sivan, the Frierdiker Rebbe was in prison. They came to the Frierdiker Rebbe's house at night. It was a Yechidus night. The Frierdiker Rebbe had sat down to eat supper late at night, and they came knocking to arrest him. The Rebbe in Tafshin Hey, when the Rebbe was already in America, so Beis Tamuz, the Rebbe came to 770. So on the street, on Eastern Parkway, there were a few Bachrim, and they struck up a conversation with the Rebbe apparently about Beis Tamuz. How was it when it happened? So the Rebbe spoke to the Bachrim and told them some things. So the Rebbe didn't say about himself, he didn't mention his name. He said that there was a Chasid. There was a Chasid who saw that there was light. The entire apartment of the Frierdiker Rebbe was lit up. All the rooms, the lights were on. So he realized that something is going on. And that was actually the Rebbe. The Rebbe was outside, and he stayed outside, not going in, because there were choshed that something is going on. The Rebbetzin knew that the Rebbe is outside. The Rebbetzin opened up the window and told the Rebbe, we have guests. So the Rebbe ran to Elechaim Altois to alert him. And together they ran to Chaim Lieberman's house. Chaim Lieberman was the Frierdiker Rebbe's secretary, and he had a lot of documents, a lot of letters, correspondence about the entire network. But he lived in an apartment complex that was closed off. You couldn't go in there. And there was a guard standing at the entrance. So somehow the Rebbe, and it wasn't Elechaim Altois, it was Elechaim Altois' son, they made their way in to alert Chaim Lieberman. Chaim Lieberman later said that he thinks that they called to him from the window. We don't know exactly, but he started burning. He made a fire in his apartment, and he started burning all the documents in an ashtray. And short while after that, they came to arrest him. He was arrested the same night. But when they came in, they got all upset. They said to each other, he already burnt everything. He already burnt everything. And that was because the Rebbe right away went to warn Chaim Lieberman. But then the Rebbe went back to the Frierdiker Rebbe's house and took all the manuscripts, the Kisvei Yad Kodesh of the Rebbeim, which the Frierdiker Rebbe kept in some suitcases, and the Rebbe brought different parts of it to different Chassidim. One pekel he brought to Reb Zalman Duchman, and another pekel to someone else. To a few Chassidim, the Rebbe divided up all the Ksavim. And you see the Frierdiker Rebbe writes in his Reshimas HaYoman that in his Reshimas HaMaisa, that he was sitting in Shpalerke and he was all concerned what's going on in the house, what's going on with my family, what's going on with my future son-in-law, the Rebbe. This is what was on Frierdiker Rebbe's mind. What's going on with the Ksavim? wrote that the Ksavim, if Chas v'Shalom, the Ksavim would fall into their hands, that would be the biggest tragedy. That was the Frierdiker Rebbe's concern. The Rebbe understood that that is the biggest concern. And that's why the Rebbe acted right away to take care of that. L'chaim, l'chaim.
Rabbi, are you going to get back tomorrow without hope? Are you going to get back?
At some point, I guess. Yeah, how are you? You're looking good. I don't know. You look young. Oil of it's sounding off when you say that, huh? Gleich gehabt.
Where's this from? And then the sound that paid Beis Yutas Kislev was the first one he remembered at the Rebbe events. He went the erste Mal zu dem Camp gesagt, und auf dem Kerl sagt, dem Apotheker soll so.
Wie die Kappe von
Chaim. But after the Kerl sagt, dem Apotheker soll so. The first time I get the Apotheker, he went, voilà.
We'll backtrack a little bit more in the story that in Pevov, L'chaim, L'chaim. A lot of Bakante Penema. You say L'chaim also. In Tafresh Pevov, in the summer of 26, the Friedige Rebbe went to Luga. It's a place, a more resort area, to rest up. He obviously didn't rest up too much. Chanim Arozov writes how the Friedige Rebbe is not resting and is writing just as much as he did at home and is constantly working. But the Friedige Rebbe writes to Rebbe Chaim Mushke from there that the Rebbe is going to come visit him soon in Luga as well. When the Rebbe went to Luga at that time, the Rebbe stayed there for an extended period of time. We don't know exactly how long, but he stayed there longer. He didn't just come to visit the Friedige Rebbe. He stayed in the house of the Rav Etkin, and the grandson of this Rav of Luga was a Rav later on in Haifa of Shor Yoshev Kohen. Famous Rav. He came to the Rebbe a few times, and he said he heard from his grandmother that the Rebbe stayed in their house because the Rebbe had to be undercover for a while. So the Rebbe was basically hiding in Luga. He wasn't just visiting the Friedige Rebbe, he stayed there for a while. Shor Yoshev says that every morning after davening, the Rebbe learned some Gemara with his grandfather, and a bissel Tanya, a little bit of Tanya too. His grandfather was not exactly a Chasid, but he was very mechabed and he respected the Rebbe, and of course he saw the Rebbe's greatness. But so the Rebbe, for that tkufa, hid away over there. In the winter of Pevov, that winter, Rebbe Tzimchane, it was before this summer, Rebbe Tzimchane went to Leningrad to check out the Rebbetzin. Still, the shidduch wasn't yet official, wasn't yet finalized. And she says, many years later, when she was in America, she said that when she was there, every time the Friedige Rebbe mentioned the Rebbe's name, like his face lit up. You were able to see the love that the Friedige Rebbe had for the Rebbe. So that was the tkufa of the Meiser. When Chaim Lieberman was arrested, and going back to what I said before, they asked him, who were the two people who came to warn you in the middle of the night? And he obviously didn't answer. He said, he doesn't know there was some two drunkards in the courtyard. He has no clue. The first time that the family and the Chassidim knew that the Frierdiker Rebbe was Bechlal still alive, the Frierdiker Rebbe actually, initially, they had planned to kill the Frierdiker Rebbe that night. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, they told him to go down a certain hallway, and he made a wrong turn. He went into, not a wrong turn, it was a right turn. And he went to a different hallway, and they forgot about him. And after a few hours, it was already past the shift, so they couldn't kill him anymore, which was mamash a mess. And during that time, that's what the Frierdiker Rebbe describes, that he was sitting there and thinking about what's going on in the house. But nobody knew, is he still alive? What happened to him? On a few days later, they allowed the Frierdiker Rebbe to write a card, like a postcard, home. The Frierdiker Rebbe wrote that they should send him to prison as Chumash Bamidbar and Alakut Teire. That's what he needed. When the Frierdiker Rebbe went to Reuven, L'chaim, good to see you. L'chaim, L'chaim L'bracha. The Frierdiker Rebbe was a heavy smoker, and the cigarettes were became like a package of pieces of paper, sheets of paper, and you put the tobacco inside and rolled it up. So the Frierdiker Rebbe had, when he went to jail, he had in his pocket over 100 papers for cigarettes, papyrossen. And when he was in jail, he wrote down on 117 of those little papers the two Maimorim that he had said on Shavuos. Bechal, the Frierdiker Rebbe, every Maimor that he said, in the week after he said it, he would write down the Maimor. Sometimes it was the week after, 2 weeks after, but he wrote down all his Maimorim. And the Seder was that afterwards he would give it out for someone to copy down, and then they would return the original, which say by the Frierdiker Rebbe. So the Maimorim of Shavuos, there were two Maimorim. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't have a chance yet to write them down. So while he was sitting in jail, he wrote them down on 117 cigarette papers.
He gave up smoking.
Years later, he gave up smoking. Talking about giving up smoking, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the doctor came to check him out. This was years later, and they told the doctor told the Frierdiker Rebbe, you have to stop smoking. It's not good for you. But while they were talking, the doctor himself lit a cigarette, and he asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, do you want one too? And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, I don't smoke. What do you mean you don't smoke? Of course you smoke. You told me that it's not healthy, so I stopped smoking. I don't smoke anymore. And that was it. He stopped smoking cold turkey like that. Says that Rebbe. I don't know. I never smoked in my life, so I don't know. I can't tell you. But from what I hear, that's not so simple to do. Anyways, so when the Frierdiker Rebbe was let out from jail on Gimel Tamuz, Tafresh Pezayin, the Frierdiker Rebbe was in his house for 6 hours. And then he had to take the train to Kastrama, where he was exiled to. So when the Frierdiker Rebbe came home, there were only a handful of people there, the family, and the Rebbe was there. The Frierdiker Rebbe handed those papyrossen papers, those 117 paperlach, the Frierdiker Rebbe gave it to the Rebbe, make sure that this should be written up and copied over. Yeah. The Rebbe shared this anecdote, so that's how we know about this. So, although the Rebbe was not yet married, was not yet the son-in-law, we see that the Rebbe wasn't just a bestam, barely involved. The Rebbe was heavily involved, and the Chassidim, it was the Rashag, the older son-in-law of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe, and Rabbi Elochaim Altois, met with a bunch of other Rabbanim, including that Rav, Tevel Katzenellenbeugen, who was organizing that conference that the Frierdiker Rebbe was against. But they made a meeting to work on getting the Frierdiker Rebbe out of jail. I don't know how much that meeting accomplished, but even this other Rav, the Frierdiker Rebbe, worked against him, but still he respected the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he was trying to help out in whichever way to free the Frierdiker Rebbe. But the Rebbe was the organizer of everything that went on during that tkufa. When the Frierdiker Rebbe traveled to Kostroma, so he took along, Rabbi Elochaim Altois went along, the Rashag went along, and Rebbe Chaya Mushka, the Rebbe's future wife, the Rebbe, she went. Reb Zalman Duchman told the Rebbe, wrote to the Rebbe many years later, that the Frierdiker Rebbe said like this: why is he picking the Rebbetzin to accompany him? He said that the oldest, Chana, she's too sharp. The youngest, Shena, is too quiet. The Rebbetzin is just perfect. So he took the Rebbetzin along. The Rebbe described how when the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Kostroma, that Shabbos, the Frierdiker Rebbe davened barichas for many hours. It was like 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and the Jewish community in Kostroma was tiny. It was barely a minyan. It had a little shul. They've never seen such a scene. They all they knew is you come to shul, you put on your tefillin or your talis, you daven, you go home. The idea that somebody can daven for hours, it made such waves. The whole Kostroma was a little nothing. Even the Galach of town came to the shul to check out the scene. What is going on here? The Rebbe shared this by Farbrengen. Could be the Rebbe heard this later on from his Rebbetzin. Could be he heard it from one of the Chassidim who was there. We don't know. But the Frierdiker Rebbe came back. Now, the Frierdiker Rebbe was notified on Beis Tamuz that he's free. Bepeil on Gimel Tamuz, he was free to Bepeil leave. So on Beis Tamuz, who was the first one to notify Chassidim that the Frierdiker Rebbe is free? The Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka, she called by phone. She called the house in Leningrad to let them know that the Rebbe is free. But she added on that it should be bli pirsum. It shouldn't be, don't make waves. Bli pirsum. No publicity about it. Many years later, many decades later, over half a century later, when it was this Pasha was the Sfarim, so they wanted to spin a tale as if the Rebbetzin said that her nephew can take Sfarim from the library. It should just be bli pirsum. Nobody should know about it. Just do it quietly. Take whatever you want to take. They wanted to spin a tale like that. So when they asked the Rebbetzin in her deposition, did you say something about bli pirsum that Barry can take some books? So she responded, the last time I recall having used the words bli pirsum was in 1927 when I notified the family that my father is coming home. That was bli pirsum. The bli pirsum, the Rebbe said that the bli pirsum became a motto of the first Beis Tamuz celebration. Because it wasn't only that. The Rebbe said that they sent out telegrams to all the cities where there were Chassidim to let them know the Rebbe is free. They signed the telegram, Bli Pirsum. And the Rebbe said, the people getting the telegram, they knew that this is not a name of someone. They understood the message. Keep it quiet. Because they didn't want hundreds of Chassidim to come from all over to Leningrad, because the situation was very, very delicate. In Leningrad, in the Rebbe's house, the Rebbe was still in Kostroma. It took him another 2-3 days to get to Leningrad. But the Chassidim, the Rebbe was there. Reb Zalman Duchman came running with the bags of ksovim that the Rebbe had given to him for safety. So he brought it back. The Rebbe is free. So the Rebbe smiled. The Rebbe told him that I'm going to reward you for this with another good news. The Rebbe is going to be home for Shabbos. They Farbrengen that night. Reb Zalman Duchman writes this to the Rebbe years later, that night they sat, just a handful of Chassidim. There was him, and there was Chassid Minkovich, and the Rebbe. They drank a lot of l'chaim, and the Rebbe, he writes to the Rebbe that this Chassid Minkovich, I think it was him, or someone else, was dancing in the Friedrich Rebbe's apartment in Leningrad, but he took off his shoes. He was dancing in his socks because it had to be Bli Pirsum. This is the Bli Pirsum is of Beis Tamuz. No, Baruch Hashem, we're sitting here tonight, Beis Tamuz, Be Pirsum, Pirsum Enise, big Pirsum is. Now we don't have to have the Bli Pirsum anymore. But initially, that was the motto of the Farbrengen of the first Beis Tamuz. L'chaim, l'chaim. Shalom Aleichem. The machine abikra meis is free. Ja, aber das mit Registration vom nächsten Jahr. Aber gar nicht mal per E-Mail. Ich habe gemeint, dass man gucken, als ich von Rand und Schau mit Corona, mit darf ich kein Geld helfen. And after the charity. Good. I did. That it was a pounding level. Never. They values. Maybe I'm making a mistake. I don't so And I got confused before. Sorry. That this Minkovich, the Rebbe wrote to him years later, reminding him that you were with us by that Farbrengen, you Beis Tamuz, Pezayin, and the Rebbe refers to it, the Hisvadus Bli Pirson. It was a Chasid Elkin, a Mendel Elkin, who was dancing in socks because Bli Pirson, you can't dance with the shoes on. The Friedrich Rebbe came home. Obviously, it was a big simcha. The Friedrich Rebbe said to my morim, Baruch HaGimel, Yudechem Kedesh, and after Shabbos, the Friedrich Rebbe wrote down the Maimorim and gave them to the Rebbe for the Chassidim to copy. The Rebbe gave it to Zalman Duchman and Minkovich to copy down the Maimer. That was the Meiser. Everybody knows that the Friedrich Rebbe was told that they're letting him out on condition that he's going to leave Russia. So in Chasidishe Elul, the Friedrich Rebbe and his daughter, Rabbi Tzachai Mushke, traveled to Rostov. And the Friedrich Rebbe didn't tell this to anybody, but Chassidim understood that, first of all, this is before he's leaving Russia, he's going to the Rebbe Rashab to see him for the last time. And he took along the Rebbe Tzachai Mushke because she was then a Kala, and so before her Chasna. The Friedrich Rebbe had to provide a list of his family who is going out with him, and he listed the Rebbe in among the members of the family. So that told the Friedrich Rebbe he's not family. So he said he's a chassan. So they told him, you can find a different chassan on the other side of the border. The Frierdiker Rebbe answered, such a chassan you don't find on the other side of the border. You don't find such a chassan anywhere. So Rosh Hashanah and maybe Yom Kippur, the Rebbe spent with the Frierdiker Rebbe, but then the Rebbe went to Katrinuslav to be with his parents. He wasn't going to see his parents anymore. Rabbi Pesach later on came out, but that was the last Yontif the Rebbe spent with his father. And Peches, Tishrei of Peches. So that is the story of Yubis Tamuz, but with a new twist a little bit, not the usual story the way we usually Farbrengen, but giving us the insight of the Rebbe's involvement throughout the entire story. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes about his first imprisonment, Hamaisur Horishin, because Tafresh Pezai in 1927 wasn't the first time that he was in prison. The first time was in 1891, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was an 11-year-old boy. And what happened then was that the Frierdiker Rebbe would get money for studying Mishnayos Baal Peh. And he knew already 2 Zdorim of Mishnayos, Zroim and Moyed, he knew by heart. So he already had amassed 30 ruble that he got for learning Mishnayos Baal Peh. And the Rebbe Rashab suggested to the Frierdiker Rebbe that he should make a gmach with that money, to give out loans to people. So the busiest time was when it was the market days in Lubavitch. There were people taking loans from the Frierdiker Rebbe. So he was a child, but he gave 3 rubles to one guy, 5 rubles to another guy. And the day before the market was very busy, and the day after the market was very busy. The Frierdiker Rebbe had to go back to collect all the loans. So the Frierdiker Rebbe went to the market, and he saw a Yid there. He was a butcher, and he was carrying a calf on his shoulder, and a sheep in his arms, and a basket with chickens dangling off his arm as well. And a policeman approached that Yid and hit him, gave him a zetz over his head. The Frierdiker Rebbe saw that. The Frierdiker Rebbe shoved the policeman and screamed at him, "What are you doing? Why are you hitting this Jew?" So the policeman, starting off as a policeman, I guess a long story short, they took the Frierdiker Rebbe, they dragged him to jail. They threw him into a dark cell. And initially the Frierdiker Rebbe was very frightened. He was an 11-year-old boy. He was scared. He didn't know what's going to be. Who knows that he's there, Bechlal? Because although there were many people in the market, but there was such a noise and tumult going on in the market that nobody even paid attention. Nobody realized what happened so quickly. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was very nervous. Who's going to come free me? Who's going to get me? Nobody knows that I'm here, Bechlal. So the Frierdiker Rebbe, that was his initial thought. But then he realized, no, it'll be good. And it was dark, but he knows Mishnayos Baal Peh. So he started chazaring Mishnayos. And suddenly he hears this noises from the other side of the cell, but he couldn't see. And he got very frightened. It sounded like an animal, but he didn't know. So then it got quiet, and then shoving, and this, and more grunts. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe remembered that he had some matches in his pocket. His friend had some matches. He gave them to him. So he lit a match. He saw it's like an animal. a kelbel, a calf, is bound up in the corner in the cell. So, so he didn't care about it. He continued Chazik Mishnayos Papa. And eventually they came for the Frierdiker Rebbe after a few hours. And they freed the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe then... The story has more details, but they brought the Yidden also to the police station. And they accused the butcher that he stole the calf that he was carrying on his shoulders. And there was another guy who made up with the policeman. I'm going to accuse that Jew for stealing the calf. This is the calf that he bought from him and you stole it. A whole story. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe obviously said, no, the calf that was stolen, that's in the cell. And they fired the policeman. This is... Defunds the police back in Ashtetl and Lubavitch in Russia. That was downsizing the police force. But the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe later, you see how good it is that you knew Mishnayos Baal Peh. Because if you wouldn't have known Mishnayos Baal Peh, there wouldn't have been a difference between you and the calf. So the Rebbe says that this story, besides for being a cute story, we have to understand, why would the Frierdiker Rebbe share a story like that? He's boasting, saying stories about himself, how great he was as a kid. Obviously, that wasn't the point. And the Rebbe gave an example from Chumash. Moshe Rabbeinu lived 120 years. And throughout his life, obviously, many, many things happened. A lifespan, 120 years. But if you add up everything that it says in Chumash about Moshe Rabbeinu, there's an anecdote here and an anecdote there. This doesn't come close to what happened in his lifetime of 120 years. So why are these stories written up in the Torah and everything else isn't written up? Because only those stories that are relevant to us, that teach us lessons for all times, were written in Chumash. So the Rebbe says the same thing. The Frierdiker Rebbe shared with us a story. Obviously, it wasn't. There was many stories. There were many, many other things that happened in his life that he didn't share. Those things that he did share, he shared them because there is an important lesson for us. And that is why he shared the story. So we have to understand what is the lesson for us from the story. Chaim, sing a nigun. Chaim. Can play Keil Bayar. Keil Bayar, you know the nigun? Keil Bayar, Meichi Shemeya, Oladoni. Good, that's Fertig jetzt, ich kann schon mal. Sicher, over an hour. That is long sicher.
Doch,
I was talking about more about going. I'm a damn.
Pleasure seeing you.
Hope so. He told me that he's nervous to walk himself. So ask for just to come with someone else.
Ich habe deine Kopf, Stücke Matane, that you live in. That you should learn with him. I said from him. Deine Kopf. He'll show you.
I shared a little bit.
I went home with him from the hill. Looked in his car. I asked him
Different things. The later years he did.
he cassette. Came to the Rebbe, you gave it in.
Right before Beis.
Yeah.
Then a half. L'chaim. in every person, in our bodies, we have a yid and a kelbo and a kaf, a nefesh habahamis. Ruach habehema hiya yiredes lemato. The behema wants all kinds of taivas, and the nefesh is. That's the ruach ha'adam. And there's darkness. The Rebbe spoke about this 40 years ago. The Rebbe went off in the middle of the Sikha. The Rebbe spoke for about a half an hour. The Rebbe didn't speak about Yidden Dafka. The Rebbe spoke about the state of affairs in America, in New York, the crime rates. You listen to the Sikha, it sounds like the Rebbe is speaking today, mamish. But it's not only about what happens in the world at large. In our own world, in our own small world, chinuch of our own children, we see from the story of Beis Tamuz how Beis Tamuz was the Frierdiker Rebbe's main focus was on chinuch of children. The Rebbe said this himself, that all the different activities for Yiddishkeit, so there were many things, mikvahs and shulm and rabbanim and shachtim, a lot of things, but chadorim, the chinuch of the future, because that's what it's all about. If there's no chinuch for the future, there's no future. So the Rebbe in that Sikha spoke very, very strongly about the proper education, even for Goyim, Kolshkin for Yidden. The Frierdiker Rebbe shared the story of his first imprisonment. The Rebbe said, not because he's talking about his greatness of in his childhood. The Frierdiker Rebbe is telling us what proper chinuch is. And the Rebbe shared different aspects of this story, how that is relevant in our chinuch. First of all, he refers to it as my Meiser Horishin, my first imprisonment. If you say there's a first, that means that there's a second and a third. And you can say one. One can be one alone. Doesn't have to be a second one. But if you say first, Horishin, that means there has to be a second one. Now, although the Frierdiker Rebbe referred to it as Meiser Horishin many years later, after he experienced other ones, but the Rebbe didn't take it that way. The Rebbe still said, HaMeiser Horishin, because already then, the stage was set for others to follow. Which means that the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, readiness to protect another Yid, to have Mesiras Nefesh on behalf of another Yid. The Rebbe describes that a policeman then instilled fear in everyone. A Jew saw a policeman, he crossed the street. They want to cross paths with him. What do I need the hassle for? You never know. In bad mood, he'll come up with some story. And the Frierdiker Rebbe went over to that policeman, shoved him, screamed at him. He wasn't nispal. That is the Mesiras Nefesh, how you have to raise children. The readiness to help another Yid no matter what. But then there is the Hagboras Hatzura Lachoymer. A Yid has a neshama. And yeah, we also have a behema in us. We have a nefesh bahamis with all kinds of taivas that has other interests in life. But we have to make sure to preserve the difference between the Yid and the Behemoth. That's what the Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe. And for that end, you can't wake up when you're in the situation. You have to prepare for that. You have to prepare for that way in advance. The Frierdiker Rebbe was able to sit there in the dark and chazer tus dorim mishnayis balpeh because he learned mishnayis balpeh for many years before the story happened. And the story only happened, why? Because he made some money. And what did he do with the money? He knew that if you have money, you have to use it for Gimel Chasadim, to use it for the right things. All these things have to be ingrained all along from when you begin the chinuch. Then, when the situation comes up, the child will be able to rise up to the occasion. The Rebbe said the Sikha, the Rebbe described it like this. Not like is the minig in this country, that the child comes home from school, so as a reward, or as to make sure that he shouldn't disturb, they say, you're a good boy, you're a smart boy, you're the best boy. So here, as a reward, you get to sit down now in front of this machine. The Rebbe said that he doesn't want to mention the name of the machine, but apparently it wasn't limited to the machine that was then in 1981. Apparently, there's different machines that this is applicable to, right? This can be all kinds of machines that the child, you get now time to spend in front of this machine. That's what the Rebbe said. And what does the child then do? He becomes a wilder kind. He doesn't have any boundaries. And it's up to him to decide how he wants to run his life. The Rebbe said that always there were people who were atheists, people who didn't believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but they never tried to make that something for the masses. You have to be of a certain class. You have to be sophisticated enough to entertain such thoughts. This wasn't for the regular people. But now, the Rebbe says, as I told you before, that this Sikha sounds like the Rebbe is speaking in Tov Shin Pei Aleph. This was 40 years ago exactly, Beis Tamuz. And you hear the Rebbe talking, when they decided to make that official, the schools shouldn't mention HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and nobody should mention HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then, obviously, if that is so, if there is no God, anything goes. That's the logical follow-up of that. So there will be more crime, and there's all kinds of mumchim, and everybody's going to try to figure out why there's more crime. Try to see what changed in the chinuch. This is what you changed. That's why it looks that way. And the Rebbe went on and spoke about this at length. But Sheva Mitzvot Bnei Noach is about Goyim. But this is not just about Sheva Mitzvot Bnei Noach. The Rebbe wasn't speaking only to Goyim. But Peil Mamish, there was hookups, this was broadcast on television, and so on. So the Rebbe spoke about it in a way that it should be relevant to non-Jews as well. But for us, the Chamilza the Pshita, in Pasha Te'esius, if we are only going to be concerned with academics, if we're not only about the chinuch of our own children, about ourselves, if it's all intellectual, if it's all learning, knowing, if there's no application, if there's no avodas atfilah, if you don't drive it home, if you don't believe, if we don't educate ourselves and our children with pashat yiras shamayim, basics, back to the basics, then the outcome might not be the same level of crime. The Rebbe in the Sikha said that the level of crime is such that today children hit the teacher. And numerous reports of such incidents were reported. The emes is that there were many more, but they don't want to report it because the teachers are afraid they're going to lose their job. Not that something will be done about it. It's very fascinating. You hear the Rebbe speak about this, and it's like 1981. Yeah, but it's very, very timely and relevant also today. But it doesn't have to be to that degree. But the concept that there is no yiras shamayim, that we are answerable to, that's the outcome. Last week by Simon Rambam, I heard a story. I get a Rav from Borough Park shared the story. He knew somebody, a Litvische Rav, who lived in New York in the 1940s, and he felt that he toils a lot in learning, but he's not matzliach enough. His chidushim, he felt dissatisfied with the output of all the effort that he put into his learning. And he felt bad about it. So he spoke to the Amshinover Rebbe. The Amshinover Rebbe came then to America. The Amshinover Rebbe told him, you got to daven better. You have to put a bit more effort into your davening, and it's going to help you with your Torah learning. He didn't, davening is davening, learning is learning, right? All right. So somebody else told him, why don't you go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Lubavitcher Rebbe is also now in America. Go to Lubavitcher, the Frierdiker Rebbe. He went to the Frierdiker Rebbe. This was, I believe he said in Tofshin Zayin, 1947. He came to the Frierdiker Rebbe. Frierdiker Rebbe told him, before you learn, you have to daven. Daven. You have to daven. And it's going to impact your learning. He said, somebody already told me that. The Frierdiker Rebbe added on, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, there's a Psamayim Chazal that Ka'achilaschem kein teraschem. The way you eat, that's how you learn. So there's different explanations for what that means. A simple explanation is that just like it's important for you to eat regularly, it's important to learn Torah regularly. But the Frierdiker Rebbe told him that by us we say Ka'avodaschem kein teraschem. That the way you daven, that's how your Torah learning is going to look. So you have to have Hakdamas HaTfilah. For Chassidim, there's always, this is not a Chiddush. Avodas HaTfilah. People think Avodas HaTfilah, gotta daven like the Frierdiker Rebbe in Kastrama till 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that the Galach in town should come listen. Davening, Pashit, B'mesinis, in one place, from beginning till the end of davening. Turn off the cell phone. Focus on the davening. Think about what you say. You're standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu davening. Just think about what you're doing. Be present. Be there. Don't just be yotzeh, fly through the words. It's not davening. Chassidim, for Chassidim, this should be the basics of the basics. That a tefillah in a Chasidishe place doesn't look that way. It's just an embarrassment. This is nothing to talk about that. And if we don't have these basics, then, like the Rebbe said, then the outcome, there's no God. Basically, if there's no emunah, there's no real connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then of course everything else looks the way it looks. So we have to go back to the basics. One time the Rebbe even said that Chassidim have to daven Shabbos, even a Bal Asik has to focus more, to give more time for davening. He should cover his face with the talis, even if he sleeps under the talis. But at least it looks like a person is davening a bit longer. Yeah. In the Maimer, the last Maimer that the Rebbe gave out, the Atat Tzava, the famous Maimer. So the Rebbe, in the end of the Maimer, demands that his grace in Yonim, that a Yid should be bothered to tresel, shooken up to the core by the fact that there's no Gilui Lakus. I don't have enough money in the bank. That troubles my sleep more. What should I tell you? I'm sharing. I'm telling you as it is. I'm not hiding. That's the emes. Yeah. So, but the Rebbe is saying that we should be so not just down. It should bother us. We should be in ganzen zu tresel, totally shooken up by the fact that Mashiach is not here yet, that there isn't Gilui Lakus. The Wolf Greenglass of Hashalom, when the Maimer came out, he spoke about this. He said, we were shaykh to these dargis. So he gave an interesting word. It says, Shulchan Aruch, that by benching you should remove the knife from the table. Why do you have to remove the knife from the table? Because one time, many years ago, millennia ago, there was a Jew who he was benching. And when he came to Rachem Uvnei Yerushalayim, he realized that the Beis Hamikdash is chorev. He got so shooken up, he just grabbed a knife and he harmed himself. It's partially dangerous to leave a knife when you bench. That's dangerous to have a knife on the table when you bench. Who knows what might happen? So Laval said, nobody around these days is going to bench and suddenly realize Beis Hamikdash is chorev and just grab that knife and do something to himself. But we still have to remove the knife. Why? You have to know that there was a Jew like that. And at least that, the appreciation for that pain. So I don't think that exactly that's what the Rebbe meant when he wrote that in the Maimer. But definitely at least that. At least there has to be the proper framework. When there's the proper framework, there is at least a chance that in that framework, more might grow, more might develop. If a davening in shul has a proper decorum, has a proper seriousness to it, then somebody might actually think about what it says in the Siddur. And somebody else might actually daven a few minutes longer. But if the whole avir, the whole atmosphere is that davening is just flying through a train, then there's no chance. So we owe it to our children. We owe it to ourselves. Yeah, the kelbel, the calf, is going to keep on kicking and keep on making grunts and protesting. The calf doesn't want that. But we have to be the Jewish child, the Nefesh Elokis, who is doing the right thing, ignoring everything else that goes on. It can be dark in the room, a dark gullus, a darker gullus than was in Tavshin Mem Aleph. It's already Tavshin Pei Aleph, and it could be 27 years after Gimel Tamuz. And yet, we know what we have to do. Hagbaras Atzura Lachaimer, living a life of dedication, Mesiras Nefesh. Chaim L'chaim. Chaim, Chaim. Chaim, Chaim. David HaMelech referred to Torah as Zmiris. David's Zmiris Koreslu. And because of that, he was punished. What happened was that it says in Tillim, Zmiris Hayu Lichukecha Beis Megurai, that he was afraid, he had enemies, and he said that when he's thinking about Torah, that helped him overcome all these hardships. Because he was misbeinen, it says in Chasidishe, he was thinking how the entire world is hanging and dependent on one dikduk of Divrei Torah, one minor detail. Example given for korbanos. A korban elevates the entire world because a korban had doimim, semeach, and chai, and the person who brought the korban. So it elevated, you brought to the mizbeach just one animal or one flower offering, and there was salt, wine. You brought a few things like that to the mizbeach, but it elevated the entire doimim of the world, and the entire tzemeach of the world. It elevated the entire world, but there were conditions. Avodah in Beis Hamikdash had to be done with the right hand, and if you did it with the left hand, you're not elevating the world. So it shows how the entire world is really dependent on one detail of a halacha in Torah. So when David HaMelech realized that, when he was contemplating that idea, so all the hardships that he experienced is nothing. The whole world is nothing in the face of Torah. In one instant, everything can be turned around. And that helps him to overcome, and he indeed actually overcame and went back to Yerushalayim and became the king. So he called Torah Zmiris. It was like a Zmira for him, which also includes the Avodah of Tefillah. Because Tefillah is Zmiris, yeah? Psuke de Zimra, praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And on the highest levels, Tefillah Leoni, Lifnei Havai Yishpech Kriyativ, Lifnei Havai Yishpech Sichai, that the Baal Shem Tov says the mashal, that a king said everyone can come into the palace and just take whatever you like. And people came, and people liked different things in the palace. Yeah, I want this lamp, I want this table, I want this chair. But there was a poor person he came to the king and said, I want to be able to talk to you every day, 3 times a day. This is what davening is. The ability, the schus of lifnei havaya yishpech sichai. And when you have that as a hakdome to the learning, like I said before in the story that the Rebbe said, so in this Maimer, the Rebbe makes the same point, that you have the hakdomas hatfila before the learning, so then zmiris hoylu chekecha, you're able to overcome everything and anything. So why was David HaMelech punished? It's doch good. Because there's another pshat in the word zmiris. Zmiris also comes from the term lezamer, to cut off. If you have weeds, you have to cut them off. And what it means is to cut off all negative klippes and sitrachre, all negative forces. The Rabbi in the Maimer elaborates. Pirya mimal, shalosh mitachas. In Aveda, very interesting in this Maimer that the Rebbe, usually in Chassidus, it talks about it, the two types of Yinikas, Achitzenim, but in this Maimer, the Rebbe speaks about it, that it's the Nefesh HaBahamis of a person can either be Pirya mimal, he goes like big, he's like Parei, Ani v'af siyoid, only I exist, I want to do whatever I want to do. Or it could be Shalosh mitachas on the lower end, where the person Pashat falls down and is mitzamtzim to such in yonim that even mitzadas nefesh bahamis he is not really shaykh to, but he falls lower than that. So you have to cut off that yanika, that allowance to veer off and go down the deep end. So that's what's called zmiris, lezamir, to cut off. So while that is an effect of tefillah and Torah, it has that effect, but that's not the purpose. That's not the tachlis. David HaMelech called it zmiras hoil chukecha. He saw that in Torah, but that's not the tachlis. The tachlis is fakert, that you take the world and you elevate the world. You transform the world. Like the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, Oziv Taziv Imoi, that you uplift the Nefesh HaBahamis and you serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'shnei yitzorecha. That is the whole Avodah. That Birur HaNitzutze is to take the Gashmistic world, elevate the world, and change the world. And that's why David HaMelech was punished, because he was focusing on something which is not really the ultimate purpose of what Torah is all about, Torah and mitzvahs. So that answers also the questions. Havayeli be'oizroi. Who are the oizroi? Who are the many helpers? When a Yid does his Avodah properly, and he elevates nitzutzes in the world around him, in himself, his own guf and nefesh habahamis, and the world around, then these sparks of kedusha, they become his oizrim. They help him in his Avodah, bringing him further and further to the tachlis. That's what it means. Havaya li be'oizroi. These are the oizroi. And likewise, when it says habol tahir, if you're only focusing on yourself, your own Avodah, you want to be a tzaddik in pelts, you want to protect yourself, make sure that you're good, you're missing the whole point of what it's all about. So therefore, Chazal tell us not habol litoher, but habol letahir, letahir acherim. If you are metahir others, mesayim loy, these others help you in your Avodah too, to come to the Tachlis Avodah. And that's going to be the Hachonah to the Avdi David, Melech Aleim, where David is Eved, like Zmiris Hoyil Chukecha, where it's an inyan of Chukim, Kabbalah Soil, not sophistication, Avdi, but he didn't only David HaMelech and also Mashiach about themselves, but V'yerd Miyom, V'kirka Kol Bnei Sheis, it changes the entire world and transforms the whole world. They should help, that we should take a V'zeichet, see this Bepel Mamish, from the Gula of Beis Tamuz, will be Mismach Gula Legula, take it from Yad Mamish. Chaim L'chaim. Now you heard the rest of the story.
Stay here for a while and go back tomorrow morning?
I hope to go back tomorrow morning. No, they say that there's so many years we could. I don't know. I'm not. Yeah. Wasn't that long ago, huh? Ich bin sicher. Good to see you again. Lachen haben. Ich bin zufrieden. Alle sind zufrieden. In most places in the world, people don't say the arbit. War Chasidishe. Das kam ja. Rabbi said, Chasidishe nefach. It's Gimel Tamuz, and it's also the quotes in the camps. There's some is fine. It's in another. So your base can be a good follow-up. The whole says of Gimel Tamuz that would apply because I'm the cashier of that session.